While some House Democrats are scrambling to try to keep the minimum wage increase in the stimulus relief package, Republican lawmakers like Mitt Romney and Tom Cotton, they've proposed their own plans to raise the minimum wage to $10 with stipulations on hiring undocumented workers. Senator Josh Hawley has also proposed a plan. His would raise the minimum wage to $15, but it would only apply to big corporations, not to small businesses.
Pretty interesting. Editor-in-chief at The Real News and host of the Working People podcast, Max Alvarez, and senior congressional correspondent at The Daily Caller, Henry Rogers. They join us now to discuss. Max, let me start with you. What do you make of these different proposals? I'll just add that Hawley also released a new one this morning for people who don't work for big businesses, which would involve some sort of tax credit scheme, but essentially give people a $16.50 minimum wage through direct payments. However, it's a bit complicated. That's what I'll make part of the problem. But Max, generally, what do you make of this new Republican competition on the minimum wage in our public discourse?
Well, I don't think it'll shock anybody that I'm not a big fan of this.
Sure.
You know, obviously, I am very much open to and encourage Republicans to get more invested in, protecting workers and lifting up working people. And, this is something that I know that you guys have talked a lot about. I know it's something that you think about a lot, Sagar. So, don't get me wrong. I grew up in a world where the Republican Party, did not even mention the working class. So I guess the very fact that it's that they're talking about this is perhaps a positive step. But here's what I see when I look at this kind of bill, this proposal, is first of all, raising gradually to a federal minimum wage of $10 an hour over the course of the next 5 years is more or less meaningless, especially when you factor in the cost of living, because the current minimum wage is so far out of whack with what it should be that, increasing it by, a couple bucks is really not going to do a whole lot to provide working people. Working people are already playing catch up from very far behind, and this is not going to do much to really help them catch up. What I see in this bill is actually Romney finding an excuse to revamp his 2012 love affair with E-Verify and package it as if it's something good for working people. But I would really stress to people watching here, right, when they're thinking about $15 minimum wage, $10 minimum wage, maybe the compromise is worth it. Google the graphs that showed the kind of disparity between union density and share of profits, share of wealth in America over the past 50 years. At about 1980, they split completely in different directions. The reason I point that out is to say that $10 or $15, neither is enough. They have stolen more from you than they could ever give back. And now they're trying to paint themselves as the generous party by giving you a little pittance of what you already deserve.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Well, and Henry, to Max's point on $10 in 5 years being kind of woefully pathetic, even in Tom Cotton's home state of Arkansas, the minimum wage actually just went up to $11 an hour. So I don't know that I don't know that this proposal is going to get a lot of traction. However, Henry, what I want to hear from you is, what do you think is the political impetus behind Republicans at least wanting to lay some kind of a marker down on the minimum wage?
Well, yeah, I mean, like Max was saying, I don't think Republicans would have ever had this conversation, even a couple of years ago. This is this is just groundbreaking stuff. I think, these policies are both very interesting. I do agree with you, Crystal. And Max, that I don't think the $10 minimum wage is enough, but I think this is hinting at something, and that's, realizing that the American workers are struggling around the country. I mean, people need help and assistance, and I think that Republicans, at least some, are certainly finding that out over time now. And I do think that, as people struggle, that people will need help. And I do think that Senator Josh Hawley's plan with the big businesses is very important. I mean, they are the people who can afford to give out these wages. I've went around D.C. and I've interviewed a ton of people who work at restaurants, who own restaurants here, really very small restaurants, nothing crazy big, no franchises or anything like that. And they've straight up told me that if they had to do this, it would destroy their businesses. And I had many waiters actually also tell me that they wouldn't want it because it would affect their tips, and all the tips that they receive
Right.
would be downgraded severely. So I just think this whole thing is very interesting, and we'll see it play out throughout the Republican Party.
I'm curious for your take on that, Max. It is a very common sentiment that we hear, and it would be a mistake to dismiss it, which is that, for example, like here in D.C., I think there was a tip minimum wage. They tried to raise it, but actually many of the restaurant workers were some of those who lobbied against it. So how do you think about this in the context of incentives and more? Your point taken, which is that the system is obviously completely screwed. Unionization and more is obviously the actual answer to all of this. But when we talk about this in discrete politics, it does seem to be a hurdle for people who do want to have a straight-up $15 minimum wage.
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind, right, is the the battle that happened in the run-up to the November elections in California over Proposition 22.
Right.
Right, because a lot of the narrative that developed, which was very much a narrative that was encouraged by the gig companies like Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash that were very much hoping to pass Prop 22, and they did by lying to the voting public. But what they did was they pitted freelancers against gig workers because the Prop 22, may complicate the relationship that freelancers have with potential employers. Like you said, it is complicated. There's a lot of stuff to be worked out. But the problem is that we were pitting workers against each other and making this seem like it was either choosing benefits for some workers and not others. And I try to avoid any sort of narrative where working people are pitted against one another. That's not to say that I'm naive about, the fact that my brother makes tips as a server, and he loves it, and he doesn't, he wants to keep making those. And also, as when you're making tips, you feel like you have a little more control over your own fate because, if you are a better server or something like that, maybe you'll get a bigger tip. I'm being very reductive about the mechanics here, but I know that as someone who has worked for tips many times, you do get a sense that you have more of a chance to make the money that you need by your own will, by your own work, yada, yada, yada.
Right.
The thing that I guess I would highlight is that the real problem is that we are focusing on the central question of wages as if it is the end-all, be-all fix for the woes of working people, when realistically, as I was just saying, the fact of the matter is that, the supports that working people need, the costs that working people bear are so great that, an adjustment in the wage is not even going to begin to solve the problem. If working people all had universal health care, this discussion would be a lot different, right? If people could actually buy and own houses, which they, largely can't, then this would be a different discussion. If we had universal child care, this would be a different discussion. But everything is pinned on kind of how many extra dollars we can get with our wage. But we have to see this in a more holistic sense and the situation that working people are facing in a society that does not support them.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. Henry, from the Democrats' perspective, part of what this indicates to me that at least some subset of Republicans feel like they need to say something about the minimum wage is that this is a very powerful political issue for Democrats. And yet they don't seem like Joe Biden's basically already taken an increase off the table, said it's not going to be in the reconciliation bill. They don't seem like they really want to push the case, even though Republicans are kind of signaling here like, gosh, this is a tough issue for us and we better do something about it. But Democrats, for some reason, have already unilaterally disarmed on the issue.
Yeah, you have AOC and that wing of the party, completely pushing forward and rightly so. I think it's interesting to see the other side of the party, the more moderate side, not. And then you have people like Tom Cotton who come out of the woodwork and you're like, wow, that's interesting to see. I think this whole thing is going to be very interesting moving forward in the next couple of weeks. It's going to be a very hot topic. I don't necessarily think throwing these minimum wage deal into a coronavirus package is the best way to handle it. I think it deserves a little more care. I think it deserves a little more care and time and focus, and maybe it should be its own thing. And that's also making things very political. I think we need to get this relief, the COVID relief, to the American people, and then focus on this minimum wage deal. I think that would be very important to the American people, so we can figure out all of this.
Lucky for you, Henry, that's the mainstream view of Joe Biden. So, okay, guys, we're gonna thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. All right, coming up, we're going to be back with Max Alvarez. He's going to discuss what's happening on the ground in Alabama as Amazon workers there are continuing to push for a union. That's when Rising continues.